When we were discussing the trophic structure of ecosystems, we were talking about community-level ecology, and when we discussed population growth curves, we were talking about population-level ecology, but we still have to talk about ecosystem-level ecology, or biome-level ecology. A biome is a major life zone on the planet. It's essentially a classification of ecosystems. So you could talk about tropical rainforest biomes, but the Amazon rainforest would be a specific location. That would be an ecosystem. You could talk about the desert biomes and make generalizations about the kinds of organisms that you would find in desert biomes, but the Sahara Desert would be an ecosystem. Biomes are classified based on the characteristic vegetation that you would find in those locations, but which vegetation survive in those locations is going to be determined by certain abiotic factors. Remember, abiotic factors such as temperature and annual precipitation. Those are the two big determiners of what kind of biome we're going to find at a given geographic location. On the animation on your screen, you can see that the temperature around the equator stays warm all year round. There's not really a lot of seasonality at the equator, and as a result you get the high temperatures, but you also get a lot of evaporation, so you get rainy conditions. Only organisms that are well adapted to warm year-round conditions and lots of rainfall are going to be able to survive in tropical biomes. The tropics are the areas directly around the equator. Only organisms that are well adapted for dry and cold conditions will survive very well at the poles, and then in between we have the temperate zones. The temperate zones occur in latitudes between the tropics and the Arctic Circle in the north and the Antarctic Circle to the south. And these generally have milder climates than the tropics or the polar regions, and they also have seasons. They have a cold season and a warm season. This is where we live. Presuming, of course, that you watching this video are one of my students. But why is it warm near the equator and cold near the poles and seasonal at the temperate zones? Well, that has to do with the way that the Earth's axis tilts in regards to the sun. You see, because the Earth has a curved surface, the light strikes most directly at the center, and then it strikes somewhat indirectly as we move further and further away from the equator. But the Earth's axis also tilts back and forth. If you watch this animation long enough, you'll see it tilting back and forth and back and forth. Now, the equator is still going to be approximately in the center no matter what, so it gets year-round direct sunlight. But for half of the year, the northern hemisphere gets a little bit more sunlight, and for half of the year, the southern hemisphere gets a little bit more sunlight. So that's not only why we have seasons in the temperate zones, but it's also why we are having summer while Australia is having their winter, and they are having their summer while we are having our winter. It's a common misconception that the reason why we have cold temperatures in winter is because the Earth is further away from the sun. It's actually closer to the sun during the winter, it's just that the sunlight is less direct as a result of the Earth's axis tilting away. You may also notice that the ocean coverage is very high around the equator, so you get a lot of evaporation at the equator, that combination of heat and water, and then the warm, moist air rises at the equator, and then it cools as it expands, but expanding makes it go towards the poles, and then as it cools down, it creates precipitation, giving us rainfall. A combination of ocean and air currents explain why we get a lot of rain at the tropics and why we have an intermediate amount of precipitation in the temperate zones. But if that were the whole story, we'd see all these biomes as nice even bands across certain latitudes, and that's not typically what we see because the local geographic features of a location also can affect the climate. So for example, as you move up in elevation, as you move up a mountainside, the air is going to expand as you get further and further above sea level, and that causes it to cool down, which causes some precipitation, which is why you typically see mountains that are capped in snow. Moving upward in elevation is sometimes a little bit like moving north in latitude. And as you move up a mountainside, you might notice that the composition of plants and animals transitions from, say, a desert to chaparral, shrubland ecosystems, to a deciduous forest, up to a coniferous forest like you would expect to see closer to the poles. An interesting side effect of the air rising and cooling and dropping its precipitation on one side of a mountain is that when the air gets over to the other side of the mountain, it's very, very dry. So you often see what's called a rain shadow effect, where you might have a water source on one side of a mountain range, and it's very, very green, lush ecosystem on that side, but then on the opposite side of the mountain range, you have desert, because there's nothing but dry air going over that area of land. So it's pulling all of the moisture out of the ground, and you get deserts. On your screen, you can see a map of the world with the various biomes colored in specific colors. And you can see that generally, certain biomes are going to be found at particular latitudes. You only find coniferous forest biomes up in the very high northern reaches away from the equator. You only find tundra biomes at the very, very north areas where it's very cold and dry. You find desert ecosystems, desert biomes in the mid-latitudes just above the equator. You only find tropical rainforests right down near the equator. You can see them in South America and Africa and Indonesia, but that there is a little bit of variation there, and that's at least partly because of the local geography. The combination of latitude and geography will result in a certain mean annual temperature and a certain mean precipitation per year, and if you know those two factors, you can actually take a pretty good guess at what biome you're going to end up in. So next, let's take a look at what's called a climograph. A climograph is a visual representation of how differences in temperature and precipitation determine which biome we are talking about. So on this graph, we have annual mean precipitation. Mean is another word for average in terms of centimeters. And then on the y-axis, we have annual mean temperature, the average temperature per year. And a lot of what this graph tells you makes a good deal of sense. If we have very low annual mean precipitation, say less than 50 centimeters per year, and a fairly hot annual temperature, we will end up in a desert biome. And only vegetation that is well adapted for hot, dry conditions will be able to survive in a desert biome. So biomes are classified based on their vegetation type. For example, you're only going to see cacti in a desert. But which type of vegetation is most fit for that location is going to be determined by the temperature and the rainfall, the abiotic conditions. Once again, the idea of fitness is popping in. As it turns out, evolution and ecology, evolution and all of biology as a matter of fact, are inextricable from each other. Biology doesn't make sense unless you take evolution into account. Why is it that if I go to a location with an annual mean temperature of 7.5 degrees Celsius and an annual mean precipitation of 150 centimeters, I will find mostly pines and firs and spruces? Because those are the only plants that are well adapted for those conditions. They are the most fit to survive in that biome, and that's why we call it a coniferous forest biome. Coniferous means cone-bearing trees like pines and firs and spruces. On your exam, I will provide you with this climograph, and I will ask you, given a certain amount of precipitation and annual mean temperature, what kind of biome would you find? And what kind of vegetation would you find in that biome? So let's talk about a few of these and the vegetation that you would find in each one. Way up north, you generally find tundra, but just below that, you find coniferous forest ecosystems. These locations are fairly cold, and they get a moderate amount of precipitation. The plants that survive here have to be well adapted for having low levels of sunlight year-round. Trees here have characteristic needles, which minimize the surface area of the leaf structure, and they're also usually covered in a thick waxy coating, which also minimizes water loss. These trees do not drop their leaves because they need to continuously do photosynthesis. There's so little sunlight that they can't afford to give up for 4 months out of the year like some other trees do, and thus they are evergreen trees. At slightly more southern latitudes in the northern hemisphere, you find temperate broadleaf forests. These are dominated by deciduous trees. Deciduous trees have broad leaves, and they typically drop them every autumn. A combination of these leaves' broad surface area and the abundant amount of sunlight in the spring and summer in these regions allows these trees to do enough photosynthesis during that period of time that they can just drop their leaves to avoid water loss when it gets cold. Because this biome changes so fundamentally season to season, the wildlife in these areas also must exhibit adaptations to deal with that cycle. For example, some animals will exhibit a bright white coat for the winter season and then a much darker coat for the warmer seasons. Typical trees in this area include sycamore and maple and oak, and this is in fact the type of ecosystem that we live in. Tropical forests are found near the equator in the tropics, logically enough, where you find high annual temperatures and high annual rainfall. The trees here grow very tall, and they are broadleaf trees like the ones that you'd find in a temperate deciduous forest. However, unlike those trees, these are evergreen trees, broadleafed evergreen trees. And the reason why they're evergreen is that there is no cold season, so why would the plants in this location ever evolve that adaptation to drop their leaves? Again, we classify terrestrial biomes based on their vegetation, but it is the environment that determines which traits are the most fit for that location. In savannas, the dominant vegetation type is grass, which is able to grow up quickly, taking advantage of the quick rainstorms that flood the area with water, sucking it up with their shallow roots before it has a chance to infiltrate into the groundwater. And because the dominant vegetation in savannas is grass, the most abundant animal in this area will be herbivores like these zebras or wildebeests, who are grazing ungulates, hoofed mammals. Of course, there's enough net primary production in this location to support higher trophic levels, so you also get some carnivores like lions in these locations as well. Deserts, on the other hand, have more variable temperatures, and those wide swings in temperature aren't too friendly to grasses. So instead, plants in these locations adapt to that climate by hoarding water. You get succulents like cactuses that have large reservoirs of water inside their bodies. Cacti are able to take advantage of the rainfalls when it does come, but then they can live off what they have stored up until the next rainfall. Now that you've seen that each type of biome has its own characteristic vegetation, and that vegetation then supports its own characteristic animal life, you can understand the concept of ecosystem diversity a little bit better. Worldwide biodiversity is enhanced by the fact that we have so many different biomes across the planet for these organisms to survive in. And no two rainforests are exactly alike, no two deserts are exactly alike, no two tundras are exactly alike. Each ecosystem has its own species diversity, supporting a unique community of plants and animals with their own mutations and adaptations. The topic that we will address in the next video is what happens when the abiotic conditions in these locations begins to change. What happens when the world gets hotter? What happens when the deserts grow larger? What happens when the climate changes?